The morning mist hung heavy over Charleston Harbor as Major Robert Anderson peered through his spyglass at the Confederate batteries arrayed like a deadly necklace around Fort Sumter. It was April 11th, 1861, and the air itself seemed to crackle with the electricity of impending war. Anderson's weathered hands gripped the brass instrument tighter as he counted the cannon mouths pointing toward his island fortress, over 3,000. Confederate troops and 43 guns trained on his meager garrison of 86 men. The Kentucky-born officer had never imagined that his military career would lead to this moment, standing at the epicenter of a nation tearing itself apart. Fort Sumter, built on an artificial island in Charleston Harbor, had become more than just a military installation. It had transformed into a symbol of federal authority in a city that had already declared its allegiance to the newly formed Confederate States of America. As reported by contemporary sources from the American Battlefield Trust, the attack on Fort Sumter marked the official beginning of the American Civil War, a war that lasted 4 years, cost the lives of more than 620,000 Americans, and freed 3.9 million enslaved people from bondage. Yet on this fateful morning, none could foresee the magnitude of bloodshed that would follow. Anderson's thoughts drifted to the events that had brought him to this precipice. Just months earlier, he had made the controversial decision to move his garrison from the more vulnerable Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter under cover of darkness on December 26, 1860. The move had infuriated South Carolina authorities, who viewed it as an act of Northern aggression. Governor Francis Pickens had declared the relocation coercive and demanded the immediate evacuation of all federal forces from Charleston Harbor, but Anderson's superior, General Winfield Scott, had been clear in his instructions: hold the fort at all costs. The aging general understood what many politicians in Washington failed to grasp: Fort Sumter's strategic importance extended far beyond its brick walls and cannon emplacements. It controlled access to one of the South's most vital ports, and more importantly, it represented the federal government's resolve to maintain the Union. The Confederate commander facing Anderson was no stranger to him. Brigadier General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, known to his men simply as Beauregard, had been Anderson's student at West Point just 2 decades earlier. The irony was not lost on either man that teacher and pupil now faced each other across the waters of Charleston Harbor, representing opposing sides in what promised to be a titanic struggle. Beauregard, resplendent in his new Confederate gray uniform, had spent weeks preparing for this moment. The Louisiana Creole possessed a brilliant military mind and had methodically positioned his artillery to create an impregnable ring around Fort Sumter. His batteries on Morris Island, Sullivan's Island, and James Island formed a triangle of death, with Fort Sumter trapped helplessly in the center. Every angle of approach had been calculated, every field of fire measured with precision. The Confederate general had received his orders directly from Montgomery, Alabama, where the provisional Confederate government had established its capital. Secretary of War Leroy Pope Walker's telegram had been unambiguous: if Fort Sumter could not be taken by negotiation, it must be taken by force. The honor of the Confederacy, Walker insisted, could not tolerate the presence of a foreign flag. Flying over Charleston Harbor. As the sun climbed higher on this April morning, both commanders understood that they stood at a crossroads of history. Behind them lay the familiar world of the antebellum United States, where compromise and political maneuvering had somehow managed to hold the nation together despite its fundamental contradictions. Before them stretched an uncertain future where the sound of cannon would replace the voices of senators and representatives as the arbiters of the national destiny. Anderson's supplies were running dangerously low. His men had been on reduced rations for weeks, and the fresh water situation was becoming critical. President Abraham Lincoln's promise to resupply the fort had led to this current crisis, as Confederate authorities had made it clear that any attempt to provision Fort Sumter would be considered an act of war. The supply ships were already en route, and time was rapidly running out for a peaceful resolution. In the growing light of dawn, both commanders made their final preparations. Anderson ordered his men to check their weapons one last time and ensure that every cannon was properly loaded and aimed. Beauregard adjusted his pocket watch and looked toward the eastern horizon, where the first gray light of April 12, 1861, was beginning to appear. Neither man knew that in just a few hours, the first shots of the bloodiest conflict in American history would echo across Charleston Harbor, forever changing the destiny of a nation. The clock in Fort Sumter's garrison quarters chimed 4 times. As the pre-dawn darkness of April 12th began to yield to the gray light of morning, Major Anderson had spent another sleepless night, his mind wrestling with the impossible situation that duty and circumstance had thrust upon him. Every military instinct told him that his position was hopeless, outgunned, outnumbered, and with no realistic hope of reinforcement arriving in time to change the tactical situation. 3 miles away, in his headquarters on Morris Island, General Beauregard was likewise awake, poring over the final details of his bombardment plan. His aide-de-camp, Captain Stephen Lee, stood at attention nearby, waiting for the order that would unleash the fury of 43 Confederate guns upon the Federal fortress. The general's fingers drummed rhythmically against his desk as he considered the weight of the moment that lay before them all. The diplomatic dance that had preceded this morning had been as intricate as it was ultimately futile. Just hours earlier, Beauregard had dispatched 3 of his most trusted officers, Colonel James Chestnut, Jr., Captain Stephen Lee, and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Chisholm, to Fort Sumter under a flag of truce. Their mission was to deliver a final ultimatum demanding Anderson's immediate surrender. The Confederate emissaries had rowed across the dark waters of Charleston Harbor in a small boat, their white flag clearly visible in the lamplight. Anderson had received them with the courtesy due to fellow officers, even as he prepared to reject their demand. The Major's response had been both dignified and defiant. "Gentlemen, if you do not batter us to pieces, we will be starved out in a few days." Colonel Chestnut, who had resigned from the United States Senate to serve the Confederacy, found himself in the awkward position of threatening his former colleague. The colonel had known Anderson for years, and both men understood that personal friendship would not be allowed to interfere with their respective duties. The conversation in Anderson's quarters had been cordial but tense, with each man recognizing that they were participating in the final diplomatic exchange before the guns began their deadly conversation. The Confederate officers had withdrawn to consult with their commander, carrying with them Anderson's written refusal to surrender. Beauregard's response had been swift and decisive. If Fort Sumter would not be surrendered voluntarily, it would be taken by force. The general ordered his emissaries to return to the fort with a final message. Bombardment would commence in 1 hour as the Confederate boat pulled away from Fort Sumter's wharf for the last time. Anderson gathered his officers for a final conference. Captain Abner Doubleday, the fort's second-in-command, had been Anderson's most trusted advisor throughout the crisis. The New York-born officer had consistently advocated for aggressive action, arguing that the garrison should make the Confederates pay dearly for every inch of Fort Sumter's ground. Lieutenant Norman Hall, the fort's engineering officer, provided a grim assessment of their defensive capabilities. The fort's walls, though thick, had been designed to resist naval bombardment from the harbor entrance, not the concentrated fire of land-based batteries. Many of the fort's guns faced seaward and could not be turned to bear on the Confederate positions. Of the garrison's 48 guns, only a handful could effectively return fire on Beauregard's carefully positioned batteries. The supply situation was even more dire than Anderson had let on to his officers. The garrison's food stores would last only a few more days, and the men were already feeling the effects of their reduced rations. Fresh water was becoming increasingly precious, and the fort's surgeon, Dr. Samuel Crawford, had warned that the garrison's health would deteriorate rapidly if the siege continued much longer. At precisely 4:30 in the morning, the silence of Charleston Harbor was shattered by the booming report of a 10-inch mortar fired from Fort Johnson on James Island. The shell arced high over the dark water, its fuse glowing like a malevolent star as it traced its deadly path toward Fort Sumter. Captain George James, commanding the battery, had been given the honor of firing the war's first shot, a distinction that would follow him for the rest of his life. The mortar shell exploded directly over Fort Sumter's parade ground, sending fragments of iron and masonry cascading down on the Federal garrison. Anderson's men, who had been standing to their guns in expectation of the bombardment, threw themselves flat as the debris rained down around them. Miraculously, no one was injured by this opening salvo, but the message was unmistakably clear. The talking was over, and the killing was about to begin. Within minutes, the entire ring of Confederate batteries opened fire in a carefully choreographed symphony of destruction. The floating battery, an innovative ironclad platform moored near Sullivan's Island, added its voice to the chorus of cannon. Shells screamed over the water from every direction, converging on Fort Sumter with mathematical precision. The fortress, which had seemed so solid and impregnable in the morning light, was suddenly revealed to be nothing more than a lonely speck of land surrounded by enemies. Anderson ordered his gunners to return fire, but the disparity in firepower was immediately apparent. The Confederate batteries could maintain a sustained rate of fire that the Federal garrison could not hope to match. Every shot from Fort Sumter was answered by a dozen from the surrounding batteries, and it became clear that this would be a battle of endurance rather than tactics. As the sun rose fully over Charleston Harbor on April 12, 1861, the Battle of Fort Sumter had begun in earnest, and with it, the American Civil War. The morning sun climbed steadily higher over Charleston Harbor, casting long shadows across the water that was now churned white by the impact of falling shells. By 7 o'clock, the Confederate bombardment had settled into a devastating rhythm that would continue without respite throughout the day. General Beauregard's carefully planned artillery barrage was working exactly as designed, with shells converging on Fort Sumter from multiple directions in a pattern that left no corner of the fortress safe from the iron rain. Major Anderson moved through his garrison like a man possessed, checking on his gun crews and offering words of encouragement to soldiers who were experiencing their first taste of combat. The reality of warfare was proving far different from the romantic notions that many of his men had harbored. The constant screaming of incoming shells, the bone-jarring concussion of explosions, and the acrid smoke that burned their eyes and throats created a hellish environment that tested every man's courage. Captain Doubleday had assumed command of the fort's return fire, methodically directing the Federal gunners as they attempted to answer the Confederate bombardment. The captain's calm professionalism under fire provided a steadying influence on the younger soldiers who looked to their officers for guidance in this unprecedented situation. Doubleday's primary target was the floating battery, the innovative Confederate ironclad that had been positioned to provide close-range fire support for the attack. The floating battery represented the South's first experiment with armored naval warfare, and its presence in Charleston Harbor was causing considerable concern among Anderson's officers. The vessel's sloped iron sides had been designed to deflect cannonballs, and early reports suggested that Federal shots were bouncing harmlessly off its protective armor. Lieutenant Hall, studying the enemy position through his telescope, reported that their shells seemed to have little effect on the mysterious floating fortress. As the bombardment continued into the afternoon, the Confederate gunners began to find their range with increasing accuracy. Shells crashed into Fort Sumter's walls with devastating effect, sending clouds of brick dust and mortar flying through the air. The fort's flagpole was struck repeatedly, requiring constant repair by brave soldiers who exposed themselves to enemy fire to keep the stars and stripes flying over the fortress. The psychological impact of the constant bombardment was perhaps even more severe than the physical damage. The garrison had been under siege for months, existing on reduced rations and living with the constant tension of their isolated position. Now, with enemy shells falling around them every few seconds, the strain was beginning to show in the faces of even the most veteran soldiers. Dr. Crawford moved among the men, treating minor wounds and offering what comfort he could to those suffering from the effects of prolonged stress. One of the most remarkable aspects of the battle was the carnival atmosphere that had developed on the Charleston waterfront. Thousands of civilians had gathered on rooftops and balconies to watch the bombardment, treating the conflict like a grand spectacle rather than the deadly serious business of war. Ladies in their finest dresses watched through opera glasses as the shells exploded over Fort Sumter, while gentlemen offered running commentary on the accuracy of various battery commanders. The crowd's enthusiasm reached fever pitch whenever a Confederate shell scored a particularly dramatic hit on the fortress. Cheers and applause echoed across the harbor as if the spectators were watching a fireworks display rather than an artillery duel that could determine the fate of a nation. Some enterprising vendors had set up stands selling refreshments to the crowd, turning the battle into a social event that would be remembered by Charleston society for decades to come. Inside Fort Sumter, the reality of warfare was far removed from the festive atmosphere on shore. Anderson's men worked frantically to repair damage to their guns and maintain their defensive positions, despite the constant rain of Confederate shells. The fort's wooden structures had begun to catch fire repeatedly, requiring teams of soldiers to abandon their posts and fight the flames before they could spread to the magazine where the garrison's gunpowder was stored. By mid-afternoon, it had become clear that the Confederate strategy was working. Fort Sumter's return fire was becoming increasingly sporadic as guns were dismounted by enemy fire and crews were forced to take shelter from the bombardment. The fortress that had seemed so formidable just hours earlier was beginning to show signs of serious damage, with gaps appearing in its walls and several of its defensive positions rendered inoperable. The psychological pressure on Anderson was enormous. He knew that his garrison situation was hopeless from a military standpoint, but he was also aware that Fort Sumter had become a symbol of federal determination to preserve the Union. Surrendering too quickly might be seen as cowardice, while holding out too long would result in unnecessary casualties among his men. The major found himself walking a tightrope between honor and practicality, with the eyes of the entire nation upon him. As evening approached on April 12th, the Confederate bombardment showed no signs of slacking. If anything, the accuracy of the enemy gunners seemed to be improving as they adjusted their aim based on the results of their afternoon's work. Anderson gathered his officers for another conference, knowing that critical decisions would have to be made before the night was over. The question was no longer whether Fort Sumter could be held, but rather how long honor required them to continue the hopeless defense. As darkness fell over Charleston Harbor on the night of April 12th, the Confederate bombardment continued with relentless intensity. The muzzle flashes from the surrounding batteries created an eerie light show against the night sky, while the whistling of shells and the crash of explosions provided a deadly soundtrack to the evening's drama. Inside Fort Sumter, Major Anderson's garrison huddled in whatever shelter they could find, knowing that the respite of darkness would bring little relief from their ordeal. The fort's barracks had suffered extensive damage during the day's bombardment, with several shells penetrating the wooden structures and starting fires that had to be extinguished under enemy fire. The garrison's quarters were no longer safe, forcing the men to seek shelter in the fort's casemates, the thick-walled gun positions that offered the best protection from the falling shells. The cramped conditions and acrid smoke made rest nearly impossible, but the exhausted soldiers tried to snatch what sleep they could between the explosions. Captain Doubleday continued to direct the fort's defensive fire throughout the night, though the return bombardment had slowed considerably due to ammunition shortages and damaged equipment. Several of the fort's guns had been knocked out of action by direct hits, while others had been abandoned when their positions became untenable. The captain's methodical approach to the defense had kept the garrison organized despite the chaos, but even he could see that their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The most serious problem facing the garrison was the repeated outbreak of fires in the fort's wooden structures. Confederate shells had been designed to cause maximum damage to fortifications, and many were filled with incendiary materials that burst into flames upon impact. The fort's supply of water for firefighting was limited, and the men were forced to risk their lives repeatedly to prevent the flames from reaching the powder magazine, where tons of gunpowder were stored. Lieutenant Hall had spent the evening conducting a detailed assessment of the fort's structural damage, and his report to Anderson was sobering. The walls that faced the Confederate batteries had been seriously weakened by the constant bombardment, with several large gaps appearing where shells had concentrated their impact. The fort's main gate had been damaged beyond repair, and the flagstaff had been hit so many times that it was held upright only by rope and determination. As the night wore on, Anderson found himself facing an increasingly difficult decision. His orders from Washington had been to hold Fort Sumter at all costs, but the reality of the military situation made it clear that continued resistance would only result in needless casualties among his men. The major had served in the United States Army for over 30 years, and a sense of duty warred with his responsibility to preserve the lives of the soldiers under his command. Confederate bombardment had achieved its strategic objectives with remarkable efficiency. General Beauregard's carefully planned artillery barrage had effectively neutralized Fort Sumter as a military threat while avoiding the massive casualties that would have resulted from a direct assault. The general's European military education had served him well, as he had applied the principles of siege warfare with textbook precision to reduce the federal fortress without unnecessary bloodshed. The spectacle of the night bombardment had drawn even larger crowds to Charleston's waterfront, where citizens continued to watch the battle by the light of shell bursts and muzzle flashes. The romantic notion of warfare that had prevailed in American society was being dramatically demonstrated in the harbor, with the reality of combat still safely distant from the civilian observers. Many of the spectators had brought picnic baskets and camp chairs, turning the siege into a social event that would be remembered for generations. Inside Fort Sumter, however, the reality of warfare was becoming increasingly grim. The garrison's food supplies were nearly exhausted, and the constant stress of the bombardment was taking its toll on the men's physical and mental condition. Dr. Crawford reported that several soldiers were showing signs of combat fatigue, while others had suffered minor injuries from flying debris and the concussion of nearby explosions. The fort's flag had become a particular target for Confederate gunners, who seemed determined to bring down the symbol of federal authority that still flew defiantly over the battered fortress. Teams of soldiers had repeatedly risked their lives to repair the flagstaff and keep the stars and stripes flying, understanding that the banner had become as important to the garrison's morale as any weapon in their arsenal. As dawn approached on April 13th, Anderson made the rounds of his defensive positions one final time, checking on his men and assessing the damage that had accumulated during the night's bombardment. The major's weathered face showed the strain of command, but his bearing remained erect and professional despite the hopelessness of their situation. He understood that the decisions he made in the coming hours would affect not only his own military reputation, but also the way history would remember the opening battle of what was already being called the War Between the States. The Confederate batteries maintained their fire throughout the night, but Beauregard had ordered his gunners to concentrate on the fort's defensive positions rather than attempting to cause massive casualties. The general understood that unnecessary bloodshed would only inflame Northern opinion and make eventual reconciliation more difficult. His goal was to demonstrate Confederate resolve while minimizing the human cost of the victory that now seemed inevitable. As the first light of April 13th began to appear on the eastern horizon, both commanders prepared for what they knew would be the final day of the Battle of Fort Sumter. The dawn of April 13th brought no relief to the beleaguered garrison of Fort Sumter. If anything, the Confederate bombardment seemed to intensify as General Beauregard's gunners, encouraged by their success of the previous day, redoubled their efforts to bring the siege to a swift conclusion. The morning light revealed the extent of the damage that had been inflicted on the Federal fortress during the night, with several sections of the walls showing serious structural damage and the interior of the fort littered with debris from collapsed buildings. Major Anderson emerged from the casemate, where he had spent the night, to find his command in a state of barely controlled chaos. Fires had broken out in multiple locations during the bombardment, and the garrison's limited water supply was being stretched to its breaking point in the effort to prevent the flames from reaching the powder magazine. The major's greatest fear was that a Confederate shell might ignite the thousands of pounds of gunpowder stored in the fort's magazine, an explosion that would certainly kill every man in the garrison. The situation became critical when a heated cannonball designed to start fires struck the fort's officers' quarters and ignited a blaze that quickly spread to the adjacent buildings. The wooden structures, dried by months of exposure to salt air and wind, burned with frightening intensity despite the efforts of Anderson's men to contain the flames. Thick smoke began to fill the fort's interior spaces, making it difficult for the gunners to maintain their positions and forcing many of the garrison to wrap wet cloths around their faces to avoid suffocation. Captain Doubleday had been forced to abandon several of his gun positions as the fires spread and the smoke became unbearable. The captain's methodical defense of the fort was being hampered not only by Confederate fire, but also by the internal chaos created by the spreading flames. Several of the fort's cannon had been rendered inoperable by direct hits, while others had been abandoned when their crews could no longer remain at their posts due to the smoke and heat. Confederate gunners had found their rhythm, and their fire was becoming devastatingly accurate. Shells were now landing inside Fort Sumter with clockwork regularity, sending cascades of masonry and metal fragments flying through the air. The fort's flagstaff had been hit so many times that it was barely standing, held upright only by improvised rigging that had to be constantly repaired under enemy fire. The psychological impact of the bombardment was becoming as significant as the physical damage. Anderson's men had been under constant fire for over 24 hours, and the strain was beginning to show in their faces and behavior. Several soldiers had begun to show signs of what would later be recognized as shell shock, sitting in corners and staring blankly at the walls while the battle raged around them. Dr. Crawford moved among the garrison, offering what medical assistance he could while trying to maintain morale in an increasingly hopeless situation. The most dramatic moment of the morning came when the fort's flagstaff was finally brought down by a direct hit from a Confederate shell. The stars and stripes fell to the ground in a tangle of rope and canvas, prompting a tremendous cheer from the Confederate batteries and the civilian spectators gathered on Charleston's waterfront. For a moment, it appeared that Fort Sumter had surrendered, and the bombardment slackened as gunners waited to see if a white flag would appear. But Sergeant Peter Hart, a veteran of the Mexican War, was not about to let the national colors remain on the ground. Despite the danger from continuing shell fire, Hart and several volunteers dashed across the fort's parade ground to retrieve the fallen flag. Working frantically while shells exploded around them, the soldiers managed to rig a temporary flagstaff using a makeshift pole and raise the stars and stripes once again over the battered fortress. The sight of the flag being raised again prompted a renewal of the Confederate bombardment with even greater intensity. General Beauregard interpreted the garrison's action as a clear signal that they intended to continue their resistance. and he ordered his batteries to concentrate their fire on the areas where the Federal flag was still flying. The general's respect for his former teacher's courage was matched by his determination to bring the siege to a successful conclusion. Inside Fort Sumter, Anderson was facing the most difficult decision of his military career. The fort's situation was clearly hopeless from a tactical standpoint, with fires raging out of control and ammunition running dangerously low. The garrison's water supply was nearly exhausted, and several of his men were showing signs of smoke inhalation and heat exhaustion. The major knew that continued resistance would only result in unnecessary casualties among his soldiers. The turning point came when the fires spreading through the fort's interior finally reached dangerous proximity to the powder magazine. Anderson realized that he could no longer risk the lives of his men for a position that could not be held. The major gathered his remaining officers for a final conference, knowing that the time had come to make the decision that honor and duty demanded, regardless of his personal feelings about surrender. As the morning of April 13th progressed, the Confederate bombardment continued with unrelenting fury, but observers on both sides could see that the end was approaching. Fort Sumter, which had symbolized Federal authority in Charleston Harbor for so many months, was finally being reduced to rubble by the carefully planned artillery barrage that General Beauregard had orchestrated with such precision. By noon on April 13th, the situation inside Fort Sumter had become untenable. The fires that had been raging throughout the morning had finally forced Major Anderson to make the decision that he had been dreading since the bombardment began. With flames threatening to reach the powder magazine and his men overcome by smoke and exhaustion, the major knew that further resistance would be both futile and criminally irresponsible. The time had come to surrender the fort that had become the symbol of Federal determination to preserve the Union. The decision to surrender was perhaps the most difficult of Anderson's long military career. The major had served the United States Army with distinction for over 3 decades, participating in the Seminole Wars and the Mexican War, and the thought of lowering the American flag in the face of enemy fire went against every instinct he possessed. However, his primary responsibility was to the 86 men under his command, and he could not justify sacrificing their lives for a position that could no longer be defended. Anderson's officers supported their commander's decision unanimously. Captain Doubleday, despite his earlier advocacy for aggressive action, recognized that the garrison's ammunition was nearly exhausted and their defensive positions had been rendered inoperable by the Confederate bombardment. Lieutenant Hall reported that the fort's structural damage was so extensive that the walls could collapse at any moment, potentially burying the entire garrison in rubble. The process of surrender began when Anderson ordered a white flag to be raised over the fort's ramparts. The improvised flag of truce was fashioned from a bedsheet, and its appearance immediately brought the Confederate bombardment to a halt. The sudden silence that fell over Charleston Harbor was almost as dramatic as the thunder of artillery that had preceded it, and observers on both sides held their breath as they waited to see what would happen next. General Beauregard, watching from his command post on Morris Island, felt a mixture of triumph and regret as he observed the white flag flying over Fort Sumter. The Confederate commander had achieved his objective with remarkable efficiency, reducing the Federal fortress in just over 33 hours of bombardment while inflicting minimal casualties. Yet Beauregard also understood that this victory marked the beginning of a conflict that would test both North and South in ways that neither side could yet imagine. The formal surrender negotiations were conducted with the courtesy and professionalism that characterized the relationship between the opposing commanders. Colonel James Chestnut, Jr., the same officer who had delivered Beauregard's ultimatum 2 days earlier, returned to Fort Sumter under a flag of truce to discuss the terms of surrender. Anderson met with the Confederate delegation in his smoke-filled headquarters, where the civilized conversation provided a stark contrast to the destruction visible throughout the fort. The surrender terms that Beauregard offered were generous, reflecting both his respect for Anderson and his desire to avoid unnecessary humiliation of the Federal garrison. The Confederate general permitted Anderson and his men to salute their flag before lowering it, to keep their personal weapons and property, and to depart Charleston Harbor with full military honors. The terms also allowed the Federal garrison to fire a ceremonial salute to their flag before striking their colors, a gesture that acknowledged their brave defense of an impossible position. The formal surrender ceremony took place on the afternoon of April 14th, with both sides participating in the ritual with dignity and mutual respect. Anderson's garrison, despite their exhaustion and the trauma of the bombardment, formed ranks on Fort Sumter's parade ground to conduct the flag-lowering ceremony with military precision. The Federal soldiers, their uniforms stained with smoke and debris, stood at attention as their national colors were slowly lowered for the final time. The flag salute that preceded the surrender provided the battle's only casualty. During the ceremonial firing of 50 guns in honor of the Stars and Stripes, a cannon misfired and killed Private Daniel Hawk instantly while severely wounding Private Edward Galloway, who would die of his injuries shortly afterward. The tragic irony of the Battle of Fort Sumter's only fatalities occurring during the surrender ceremony was not lost on the participants, who saw it as an ominous portent of the bloodshed that was to come. As the Federal garrison prepared to leave Fort Sumter, Anderson took one final walk through the fortress that had been his home and responsibility for so many months. The major's inspection revealed the extent of the damage that the Confederate bombardment had inflicted. Walls breached in multiple locations, buildings reduced to smoldering ruins, and the parade ground littered with debris from collapsed structures. Yet despite the physical destruction, Fort Sumter had served its symbolic purpose by demonstrating Northern resolve and forcing the Confederacy to fire the first shots of the war. The departure of Anderson's garrison from Charleston Harbor marked the end of the Battle of Fort Sumter, but it also represented the beginning of a much larger conflict. As the Federal soldiers boarded the transport vessel that would carry them to New York, both sides understood that the shots fired over Charleston Harbor had set in motion events that would transform American society forever. The gentlemanly conduct that had characterized the Fort Sumter engagement would soon give way to the brutal realities of modern warfare as North and South girded themselves for a struggle that would determine the future of the American nation. News of Fort Sumter's surrender spread rapidly throughout both the North and South, galvanizing public opinion and making peaceful resolution of the sectional crisis virtually impossible. President Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion followed quickly, while the Confederate government prepared for a war that many on both sides believed would be brief and decisive. The steamship Baltic pulled away from Charleston Harbor on April 15, 1861. Carrying Major Anderson and his garrison toward New York and an uncertain future. As the Federal soldiers watched Fort Sumter recede into the distance, many reflected on the events of the past few days and wondered what they had witnessed. None could have imagined that the relatively bloodless bombardment they had endured would be remembered as the opening engagement of the bloodiest conflict in American history. The reception that awaited Anderson's garrison in New York demonstrated the profound impact that the Battle of Fort Sumter had already had on Northern public opinion. Thousands of cheering citizens lined the waterfront to welcome the defenders of Fort Sumter as heroes, while newspapers proclaimed their brave stand as an inspiration to all loyal Americans. Anderson, who had been tormented by doubts about his decision to surrender, was surprised to find himself hailed as a national hero, rather than criticized for his failure to hold the fort. The transformation of public sentiment in both North and South, following the bombardment of Fort Sumter, was remarkable in its speed and intensity. Northern newspapers that had previously counseled moderation and compromise now called for immediate military action to preserve the Union. The attack on Fort Sumter was portrayed as an unprovoked assault on the American flag, and editorial writers demanded that the insult be answered with force. The complex political and economic issues that had led to secession were suddenly simplified into a stark choice between loyalty and treason. In the South, the successful reduction of Fort Sumter was celebrated as proof of Confederate military prowess and determination. The bloodless nature of the victory was seen as evidence that the North lacked the will to fight for Union preservation, and many Southerners believed that a few more such demonstrations would convince the federal government to recognize Confederate independence. The carnival atmosphere that had characterized the civilian response to the bombardment reflected a widespread belief that the conflict would be brief and relatively painless. General Beauregard found himself elevated to the status of Confederate hero, his careful planning and professional execution of the bombardment earning praise from military experts and civilian leaders alike. The general's European military education and his methodical approach to siege warfare had produced exactly the result that Confederate leaders had hoped for, a clear demonstration of their resolve, without the massive casualties that would have inflamed Northern opinion. Beauregard's stock rose considerably in Confederate military circles, and he would soon be given command of much larger forces as the war expanded. President Lincoln's response to the fall of Fort Sumter was swift and decisive. On April 15, the same day that Anderson's garrison departed Charleston Harbor, Lincoln issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days to suppress the rebellion. The president's call for troops was based on the assumption that the conflict would be brief, and that a show of federal determination would quickly bring the seceded states back into the Union. The 90-day enlistment period reflected the widespread belief that the war would be over by summer. The immediate consequence of Lincoln's call for volunteers was to push 4 additional states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, into the Confederate camp. These states had initially rejected secession, but the prospect of federal troops marching through their territory to suppress their southern neighbors proved unacceptable. The expansion of the Confederacy from 7 to 11 states dramatically increased the South's military potential and ensured that any conflict would be far more extensive than originally anticipated. The Battle of Fort Sumter had achieved something that months of political maneuvering and compromise efforts had failed to accomplish. It had clarified the issue and forced both sides to choose between Union and independence. The complex constitutional and economic questions that had dominated political discourse for decades were suddenly reduced to a simple test of strength. The time for debate and compromise had passed, and the time for action had arrived. As referenced in contemporary accounts from the National Park Service, the bombardment of Fort Sumter marked a point of no return in American history. The shots fired across Charleston Harbor on April 12th and 13th had accomplished what years of political rhetoric could not. They had made war inevitable and drawn clear battle lines between North and South. The military lessons learned from the Battle of Fort Sumter would prove prophetic for the larger conflict that followed. Beauregard's systematic use of artillery to reduce a fortified position demonstrated the changing nature of warfare in the industrial age. The effectiveness of concentrated bombardment against traditional masonry fortifications would be repeated countless times throughout the Civil War. As commanders on both sides learned to appreciate the destructive power of modern artillery, the symbolic importance of Fort Sumter extended far beyond its military value, and both sides understood that they were fighting for the hearts and minds of their respective populations as much as for strategic advantage. The fort became a rallying point for Northern determination to preserve the Union, while its capture served as proof of Confederate resolve and military capability. The battle had established precedents for the conduct of the war that would influence military and political decisions for the next 4 years. The gentlemanly conduct that characterized the Fort Sumter engagement would soon seem like a relic from a more civilized age as the war expanded and intensified. The courteous treatment of prisoners, the respect shown for enemy flags, and the minimal casualties inflicted during the bombardment would give way to the brutal realities of battles like Bull Run, Shiloh, and Gettysburg. The romantic notions of warfare that had been on display in Charleston Harbor would be shattered by the industrial-scale slaughter that modern weapons and tactics made possible. Major Anderson never returned to active field command, his health having been broken by the strain of the siege and its aftermath. However, he remained a powerful symbol of federal determination throughout the war, and his dignified conduct during the surrender had earned him respect from both North and South. When Charleston was finally recaptured by Union forces in 1865, Anderson was given the honor of raising the same flag over Fort Sumter that he had been forced to lower 4 years earlier. General Beauregard went on to command Confederate forces at the First Battle of Bull Run, where his tactical skills again proved decisive in achieving Southern victory. However, the general's relationship with Confederate President Jefferson Davis deteriorated over time, and he never achieved the level of influence in Confederate military circles that his early successes had seemed to promise. The careful planning and professional execution that had made him the hero of Fort Sumter would be overshadowed by the larger personalities and more dramatic battles that followed. The civilian spectators who had watched the bombardment of Fort Sumter with such enthusiasm would soon discover that war was far different from the theatrical spectacle they had witnessed in Charleston Harbor. The ladies who had watched through opera glasses and the gentlemen who had offered commentary on the accuracy of the gunners would find their own lives transformed by a conflict that would touch every family in America before it ended. The Battle of Fort Sumter had lasted 33 hours and produced only 2 casualties, both during the surrender ceremony. Yet those 33 hours had changed the course of American history more dramatically than any comparable period before or since. The thunder that had echoed across Charleston Harbor on April 12th and 13th, 1861, would continue to reverberate through American society for generations to come. A reminder of the moment when compromise failed and the nation chose to settle its differences through the arbitration of war. The fort itself would remain in Confederate hands for nearly 4 years, serving as a symbol of Southern independence and a constant reminder to federal naval forces of their failure to maintain control of Charleston Harbor. The battered walls that had withstood Beauregard's bombardment would face countless additional shellings as Union forces attempted to recapture the strategic position, but Fort Sumter would not return to federal control until the evacuation of Charleston in February 1865. When the guns finally fell silent and the armies returned home, Americans on both sides would look back on the Battle of Fort Sumter as the moment when their nation's destiny was decided. The shots that had seemed so significant in April 1861 would pale in comparison to the carnage that followed, but they would always be remembered as the beginning of the end of one America and the birth of another. The thunder over Charleston Harbor had announced not just the start of a war, but the transformation of a republic into a modern nation, forged in the crucible of civil conflict and tempered by the sacrifice of 600,000 American lives.